Yes.
So as we heard from the evidence of Dr. Winter, Professor Savage was instrumental in the arrangement made by Dr. Winter, Professor Savage, and two others in 1984 to use heat-treated products on a named patient basis in response to the AIDS crisis. We can see from Professor Savage's evidence to the Archer inquiry that he had a long-standing interest, if I can put it that way, in attempts to heat-treat products. And we can pick it up in his oral evidence to the Archer inquiry. Henry, it's ARCH 5011, please. And if we go to page 116, using your pagination, Henry. So we can pick it up at the bottom of that page, where Professor Savage says this, referring to suspicions about non-A, non-B hepatitis being conveyed through the blood and through large pooled products. He says this: that is the simple reason why 99.9% of producers of commercial factor 8 and factor 9 in the world then started to invest money in their research and development departments to clean up their blood products. At the end of the 70s, in fact, the first product that was produced to go into patients was produced in Germany in 1978, and they treated, I think, about 34 patients with it over 2 years, following all the parameters, because the Germans are quite strict about these things, following every known parameter, and they demonstrated quite clearly that there was no biochemical evidence of transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis using a pasteurized product. And they made representations over here to a number of my colleagues, I believe. There was never really any report that came back about this. And I would assume that they came here to explain their findings in greater depth because this was available to people who were attending conferences. And if we then go on, Henry, to page 129, please. He says at the bottom of the page, I first started using heat-treated products in 82. So he is suggesting here that he's doing that rather earlier than the initiative then in 1984 with Dr. Winter. I first started using heat-treated products in 82 after going through lots of discussions with the Americans in 81. That was for the first trial, and the second trial was started about 84/85. For trial purposes, it cost absolutely as much as BPL's product, namely zero. But because it was quite clear that in some patients, and it was meant to treat non-A, non-B hepatitis to prevent it, so you had to use naive patients, by which he means either virgin haemophiliacs or pups, either of those two unfortunate terms, patients who had not been exposed before, because the majority of the data that came out, should we say, 1 year to 1.5 years later after the trial started was very encouraging. And it looked as if that particular combination of 38 degrees Celsius for 72 hours was enough. My view was very much, well, that must be better, even if it costs something, than giving a patient what I know for sure, that it is loaded in 100% of cases with non-A, non-B hepatitis, namely the BPL product. So although I never used any BPL products, it all went to the 26 smaller centres in the southeast because they had the first bite of it from the blood transfusion service. I was always left with nothing at the end of the year, so I had to survive on money initially from the district and subsequently from top slicing of the region. So I knew most of these companies, and it was quite easy to get involved as the trial coordinator over here to test out the first products which were heat-treated and available for research. I couldn't get any of the German stuff which I really wanted, for the simple reason that after they came over here in discussion with some doctors and some people in 1981, they were scared away. They never decided to come back, so it was a bit difficult to get any product. I think they had such negative vibes here that they thought, well, let's stick to France, Belgium, Sweden, the US, and the rest of the world. And then he goes on to say that there was a perception amongst quite a number of haemophilia treaters that the BPL product was safer, relatively safer, I can't quantify it, than the American commercial product because there were slightly fewer donors in the large donor pool. And he goes on to explain that difference of perception. And then if we go on, please, to page 142, Henry. We pick it up, second paragraph. This way, he says this in very simple terms. Lots of people try to explain it on other bases, but the most logical thing is the fact that you kill the virus, it is not there. So we felt perfectly justified in going out and completely disobeying the current ethical concepts and everything else, which I was accused of being a charlatan at one stage, which I thought was quite nice. And then he says that was definitely a compliment coming from those people. So that's an account in his own words of his interest in heat-treated product really from the late 70s onwards, and his involvement in early trials, and then his use of the heat-treated product following the trials in 1984, along with Dr. Winter and others. There's a further document I should draw your attention to, sir. It's at PRSE 0004577. If we go to the second page, please. So this is a newspaper article. We can't date it precisely, but it would have seemed, or we haven't currently dated it precisely, but it's probably 1984. And if we look in the bottom, the left-hand column to start with, we can see the journalist reporting what he'd been told from St Thomas's. St Thomas's Hospital, London, which serves haemophiliacs from South East and South West Thames area. 2 patients who received exclusively NHS factor 8 from Elstree are also carrying the suspected AIDS virus antibodies. The director of the Haemophilia Centre there, Dr. Geoffrey Savage, said, "It's going to be hell on earth when this comes out. I am dumping all my commercial factor 8 from the US in favour of heat-treated material. The majority of my patients will be getting it within the next 3 days. It's more difficult politically and practically to dump the NHS factor 8, because if I did that straight away, the switchover would bankrupt hospitals in the area. It will have to be phased out. I'm not prepared to wait and expose my patients to the risk. It's a horrible issue and a horrible dilemma." And then it said, the journalist said, recent evidence suggested that NHS factor 8, which is not heat-treated, might be contaminated. And Dr. Savage says, one cannot be sure, and from the patient's point of view, it would be better not to use it until one is damn sure it is okay. It's not entirely clear how one reconciles that with exactly what he told the Archer inquiry, because this would appear to suggest at the time that he was using commercial factor 8, non-heat treated, and some NHS factor 8.
I think the date of this is most probably the 20th of December.
Yes, it may be.
My reason for saying that is that it was said to be, in some sources, a suggestion that the Yorkshire Post was going to publish an article on the 13th of December, which led to Professor Ludlam in Edinburgh holding a meeting on the 19th, because he feared, or maybe thought that he feared, that the press were going to release details the next day.
Yes, that may well be right.
I think that's probably the date.
It probably is, because it ties in with the evidence that we looked at yesterday with Dr. Colvin. You'll recall there were communications late December, early January 1985, so after the Elstree meeting on the 10th of December, in which there's an issue about the extent to which there's going to be usage of heat-treated products or usage of existing stock, and reference is made to there being reports in the media. So that date would fit in with all those matters, sir. So that's Dr. Savage as reported by a journalist at the end of 1984.
In fact, we've got a reference to the Scottish batch, which might have produced problems for the NHS in the middle of the second column from the left on the page, which is on the screen.
Yes.
A comment made by Professor Bloom, I think.
Yes, and reference to the Yorkshire Post as well.
Interestingly, he's quoted as saying, regrettable that this is, it does not really constitute a comparable situation with the USA, where I believe almost every batch of Factor VIII is contaminated. So whatever Professor Bloom's views may have been, they're then reported in rather different terms here.
Yes. In terms of use of heat-treated product, other than what we have from Professor Savage in his Archer evidence, and obviously what we understand through Dr. Winter's evidence, we don't have a huge amount of contemporaneous material. Otherwise, we do have a document at SHPL 0000983_002. This is a January 1983 document. It's an internal Travenol Highland document. We can see the subject is Highland Therapeutics meeting to discuss regulatory issues, 19th of January 1983, and the memo itself is dated the 27th of January 1983. If we go to the bottom of the second page, please, Henry, we can see here reference to a trial at St Thomas's Hospital. So under the heading Haemophilia T, the UK trial at St Thomas's Hospital was discussed. Dr. G. Savage is very keen to have product immediately, as he has had to treat 3 of his 5 initial virgin haemophiliacs with non-treated product, that presumably is non-heat treated product, and so now has only 2 patients left in the trial. It's therefore been decided to supply product on a prescription release basis until full clinical trial exemption approval has been received. So we can see there some confirmation of the Professor Savage's involvement in a trial of heat-treated material as at the beginning of 1983. And there is a document then from 1985, BAYP 000000, so 6 zeros, 7_113. This is rather later on, so this is a memo dated the 2nd of October 1985. It's a Cutter Laboratories document. It's headed Area Report, September 1985. And under the heading Major Happenings, Derby, we can see it says results from a virgin haemophiliac using prophylate HT demonstrate that the patient has raised transaminases suggestive of non-A, non-B hepatitis. And reference there is made to Dr. Mitchell, who was the Haemophilia Centre Director at Derby. But then we just see in brackets, it's worth noting that this patient is using a different batch to the one that's caused non-A, non-B hepatitis in 3 of Dr. Savage's patients. So it would appear from that by 1985, Dr. Savage has been using prophylate HT in some of his patients, 3 of whom have developed non-A, non-B hepatitis. We don't know any more currently than is set out in that document about that particular issue. So we do know that Professor Savage had a range of interactions with pharmaceutical companies from trials such as this. There are a number of references to him being either an investigator or medical advisor in trials or in product license applications. And we have documents which demonstrate involvement in relation to high-HC, that's the Spayward porcine product, and haemophil. If we look at BAYP 000024_051, we can see reference to him having had some discussions with a pharmaceutical company rep in relation to co-8HT, and that would perhaps fit in with what we then saw in the document we just looked at. So this is a letter to Dr. Savage thanking him for his hospitality and confirming the prices for the co-8HT heat-treated factor 8 product and the co-9 heat-treated product. We don't currently know, I think, whether he used the co-9, but it looks highly likely that he may have used co-8HT at some point. Again, looking at Dr. Savage's oral evidence, Professor Savage's oral evidence to the Archer inquiry, he talked in general terms about the relationships between doctors and pharmaceutical companies. And it is, I think, worth going to that. Henry, it is again ARCH 5011, please. And if we go to should be your page 146, Henry. The question that Professor Savage was asked is at the top of the page: what funding did doctors receive from plasma companies? Were any haematologists acting as paid advisors to companies or received incentives with regard to research funding or funding for lectures, etc., etc.? And he's asked if he has any comment. And this is Professor Savage's response. Generally speaking, if one had dealings with a commercial company, and I have probably had more dealings with commercial companies than most, the rules are very simple. They pay for everything to do with the research that they expect you to do. That includes patient travel, patient expenditure, how much it costs to photocopy the notes, etc., etc., what the lab costs cost, and they get a breakdown of each and every cost before you even embark upon signing anything. One is expected as part and parcel of being involved with the research product for a commercial company to actually present one's data. You can't expect 6,000 people to travel halfway across the world and cram them into St. Thomas's dining room. So you have to go where you're requested to go and give a presentation. You may be offered an honorarium or you may not, but that really covers the fact that you're up until 2:30 doing a report or something similar, and you expect perhaps to have at least a few shekels to keep your eyes open. So I think it depends very much upon the individuals of what happens. In my case, I had funds which existed within the hospital and within the trustees, and money was paid directly from those companies into those trust funds. So I actually never saw the money, although I did have the luxury of spending it, as I was the only signatory, but it had to be spent on something which related to the project, whether a staff member or the agents or anything else. I am aware that there were many colleagues at that time particularly who were working as consultants for commercial companies. And I suppose in a way there were some which were working not necessarily on a remunerative basis for companies such as BPL because BPL required advice. It may well be that perhaps such incentives could be recommendations for this or recommendations for that. I have no idea because I had no dealings with BPL. So the answer to your question is probably yes, depending upon the individual. How much? No idea. Because that is directly proportional to greed more than anything else. And really, you know, these things happen all the time in all walks of life without necessarily being related to medicine or HIV or blood product. So you'll see there, sir, he talks about what he says were the arrangements within St. Thomas's for money received from pharmaceutical companies. In terms of the more general point he makes about colleagues working as consultants for commercial companies, unfortunately, the question isn't asked of him, who are you referring to? And so we're not in a position to know whether there are particular individuals he had in mind, and if so, who they were. There is some evidence to suggest a particularly close relationship between Professor Savage and Armour. If we look at ARMO 0000505_001, please, Henry. This is again an internal memo. It's dated the 6th of March 1986. The subject is UK Haemophilia Centre Directors Meeting, St Thomas's Hospital, 17th of March. And it said this: following the above, at which it is anticipated most, if not all, the UK directors will be present, a meeting of the Hemostasis Club will be held. I'm not quite sure what that is there. The topic being blood products. Dr. Zuckerman or Dr. Williams, consultant hepatologists from King's, will be invited, as will Dr. P. Kernoff from the Royal Free to talk on clinical trials, Eric Preston from Sheffield to talk on liver disease, Charles Ritzer from Oxford to talk on the NHS 8Y experience, and Dr. Lane from the Blood Products Laboratory at Elstree to talk on UK self-sufficiency. The chairman will be Jeff Savage from St Thomas's, who, together with Doctors Kernoff and Preston, are the leading advocates for the safer wet heat-treated alpha factor 8 prophylate. I suspect that this could be a very cleverly connived meeting at the instigation of either these three clinicians or Alpha themselves to convert all directors to a product which can be shown to have a better track record with regard to the elimination of non-A, non-B hepatitis. It is also obviously an attempt to expose the potential mid/long-term problems associated with liver disease and haemophilia, as initially advocated by Hay et al. In articles in the Lancet during 1985. And then going to the last paragraph, I know you will appreciate the vital significance and importance of this meeting to haemophiliacs, clinicians and the factor VIII producers alike. And in your absence, Robert has agreed to accompany me. I also strongly urge in the most forceful terms that Bill Terry or Mike Hindra or somebody from the US attends this meeting to hear the story from the horse's mouth, and particularly as it relates to our market position in the UK. And then this: Jeff Savage has kindly agreed to put questions on our behalf to the panel, and this will be an ideal opportunity to obtain an authoritative opinion from the leaders in the field on any subjects which are of particular interest to us. And I would suggest that one or two very carefully constructed questions be discussed between us and put to Jeff in advance. A potentially revealing insight into relationships between pharmaceutical companies and clinicians, and meetings which we don't currently have formal records of, such as this meeting of what's described as the Hemostasis Club. So I turn to consider thematically developing knowledge of risk of hepatitis, in particular non-A, non-B hepatitis at St Thomas's. There are a number of references in communications from Professor Ingram to others in the 1970s to incidents of jaundice or hepatitis. It's not usually clear whether what is being considered is hepatitis B or non-A, non-B hepatitis. Often the term is just generically hepatitis. There's some references to post-transfusion hepatitis. Occasionally there's a clear reference to Australia antigen. There are communications by way of example, and we've included in our written notes a handful of examples, with Dr. Maycock, Dr. Main in Belfast, with Trelaws, which raise issues about either particular batches or particular patients in the context of either jaundice or hepatitis or liver function tests. Well, if we just look at one meeting from September 1975, it is OXUH 0003735, please, Henry. This is a meeting from the 18th of September 1975. It's the meeting of Haemophilia Centre Directors. Dr. Ingram at that time was the Haemophilia Centre Director for St Thomas's. And if we go, please, Henry, to page 4. we can see there towards the top of the page the heading Progress of the Director's Study of Jaundice and Factor VIII Antibodies, and there's reference to a paper presented by Dr. Biggs, and then a full discussion about the incidence of hepatitis and the problem of anicteric cases. And then just wanted to draw your attention, sir, towards the bottom of the page. So I think I should, in fairness, point out there's a discussion about how it can be difficult to interpret liver function test results. Bottom of the page, we see this. The influence on the pool size of material used for fractionation was discussed. Professor Ingram said that NHS Factor VIII was derived from pools of 500 to 750 donations, whereas the commercial Factor VIII was often derived from pools of 2,000 to 6,000 litres of plasma, and that the probability of including an infected donation was greater with commercial Factor VIII. So Professor Ingram there clearly alive to the differential pool sizes and its potential significance.
Now, a donation of plasma would generally be, what, half a pint, roughly. And a litre is roughly 2 pints. So a litre is about 4 times
Yes.
4 donations. So the scale that would indicate, and I appreciate that I'm yet to hear a small presentation on pool sizes, that at this time, the view of the speaker was that NHS concentrate had about 500 to 750 donations, whereas commercial plasma had somewhere upward of 8,000 to whatever it was.
Yes, and it's obviously right to note that we see references to all sorts of different pool sizes in all sorts of different documents, in particular in the course of the 1970s. And clearly it will be important to achieve as much clarity as possible as to what in truth the relative pool sizes were. But certainly here Professor Ingram's understanding is that there is a difference, and it's a difference that he at that time regarded as relevant.
Well, it's a very substantial magnitude greater.
Yes. And still sticking with Professor Ingram and the 70s, he was a fairly loyal attender of the centre directors and reference centre directors meetings, and so would have been privy to, for example, the reports that Dr. Krask used to produce. And we can see an example of that at PRSE 0002268. Please, Henry. So this is a Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting in January of 1977. Professor Ingram is one of the listed attendees. And if we go to page 6, I think it is, Henry, it's at least... No, page 10 then. That's it, internal pagination 6, thank you. We can see at the bottom of the page... this is just an example of a fairly typical occurrence at these meetings. Under the heading Study of Hepatitis in Haemophilic Patients, Dr. Krask presented a written report to the meeting and outlined the findings. And it refers to a follow-up of 371 patients receiving haemophil. It says this: only one death was possibly attributable to hepatitis B. Dr. Krask is then suggesting a special study in relation to those with factor VIII antibodies receiving large doses of concentrate. And then he says he would like to continue a study over the next 2 years, a follow-up of patients who'd had haemophil-associated hepatitis, to study the incidence of chronic sequelae and a comparison of jaundice associated with NHS factor VIII and commercial product. There's a ongoing discussion. And then the question is raised about halfway down the page. Dr. Mibashan asked Dr. Krask to clarify how he distinguished between hepatitis B and non-B types, and Dr. Krask said he looked at each individual case. So a clear awareness there of there being these two, at these times, different forms of blood-borne viral hepatitis, but perhaps not particularly illuminating in terms of advancing the knowledge of the nature of the non-A, non-B hepatitis. Professor Savage talks again in his evidence to the Archer inquiry about the developing state of knowledge in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis. So could we go back to that, please, Henry? Again, it's ARCH 5011. And if we could go, please, to page 115. We can pick it up at the bottom of the page. In fact, no, sorry, we'll pick it up halfway down the page. He's talking about a failure to implement self-sufficiency, which he describes as a mixture of safety and finance. And then he says at line 11, it became pretty clear towards the end of the 70s that non-A, non-B hepatitis, as it was called then, was not merely just a biochemical abnormality that a few chemistry departments picked up. It did have clinical impact, but not in the short term necessarily, in the longer term, and that all concentrates made from large donor pools had a similar rate of infectivity, and there's the 100% on first exposure point, which obviously will need to be looked at in more detail at a later stage. But he then goes on to talk about non-A, non-B hepatitis in these terms. You had two schools of thought. One school of thought was that this causes problems, and it was backed up by a lot of tissue work biopsies, liver biopsies, which showed progressive liver disease. And then you had another group of individuals who are quite happy to say that, we just measure it with blood tests, and the blood tests stay the same. So we just think it's a little bit of inflammation of blood tests from the liver, so-called transaminitis, which has no clinical connotation and which is merely a figment of a few people's imagination. So by the time the histology data started coming through, and by the time children started developing cirrhosis of the liver, that may be a reference to that 1980 article that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, perhaps it was a little bit more than inflammation of blood tests. So I think the majority of responsible physicians and people treating these patients knew by the end of the 70s, in fact, pretty closely around 78, I think, tipped it, that large donor pool concentrates, whether it be for factor 8 or factor 9, were the cause of non-A, non-B hepatitis. Nobody knew what the agent was, but they assumed it was an infective disorder. It came from an infection, and as time moved on, it became proven that that was the case. So there is Professor Savage identifying those he describes as two schools of thought. He picks it up again. If we go to page 120, please, Henry. He's asked a question about non-A, non-B hepatitis, and he says this at line 10. The definition of non-A, non-B hepatitis, which was invented, in fact, by an Italian, to complicate it even worse, was that you would follow certain liver function tests on a regular basis, usually every 2 weeks. And if those liver function tests exceeded 2.5 times the upper limit of normal on 2 occasions with a minimum of 6 weeks apart, after being exposed for the first time to a large donor pool product, by definition, you had non-A, non-B hepatitis if you were negative to hepatitis B and hepatitis A and CNV, the other things that can cause problems. And then he says at the bottom of the page, essentially it's a diagnosis by exclusion, and says this: it was pretty effective doing it by exclusion because you got rid of CNV, and usually the type of patients we were talking about, if you were treating children in the way that was recommended with low donor pools, they should not have problems, at least until they reach 50 bags of cryoprecipitate. They should not have problems with non-A, non-B. And then he goes on to talk about it being a combination of biochemical diagnosis. If you were lucky but the patient was unlucky, they developed symptoms as well, but those symptoms were highly variable, and there was a variable incubation period. So you could have something, shall we say, after 2 to 4 to 6 weeks, which resembled influenza, or after 3 months you could become extremely jaundiced and very sick, very, very variable.
So summing that up, he's saying that in some cases you get an acute infection. In other cases, the way you work out whether it's non-A, non-B is, first of all, positive material, which they raised liver enzymes, but secondly, a diagnosis of exclusion.
Yes.
It's not. one of the other things.
Yes.
So what you're left with is the only marker clinically is the raised liver enzymes.
That is what he's saying, yes.
Thank
you. Professor Savage had attended, once he took over from Professor Ingram, the meetings of UKHCDO on a regular basis. At his first meeting that he attended, which was the 20th of November 1979, Dr. Krask there spoke on behalf of the Hepatitis Working Party and talked about non-A, non-B viruses and the possibility of a relationship with different methods of fractionation. Again, I'm not going to go to all these documents, so we've seen either most or all of them. Professor Savage attended his second meeting of Haemophilia Reference Centre directors in September 1980. And as really with all the meetings at this time, non-A and non-B hepatitis was discussed, and there is information provided by Dr. Krask. We know, both from documents that we've seen and from the testimony of patients, that liver function tests were being undertaken and presumably analysed in the way Professor Savage describes during this period. In terms of the knowledge, developing knowledge of in relation to HIV, again, we can trace Professor Savage's attendance at key UKHCDO meetings through the documents. I'll just refer to some of the key dates there because these are all documents we've looked at very recently. So he attended, for example, the Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting in Manchester on the 13th of September 1982, in which Dr. Krask, having been asked to look into the report from the States of AIDS, provides a brief update. And that's the meeting where the records refer to a remote possibility that commercial blood products had been involved. Professor Savage also attended that meeting on the 24th of January 1983 at the London Airport Hotel with Immuno. We've now looked at it on a number of occasions. And so you will recall that there is in one of the records of that meeting what appears to be a detailed discussion about the currently available information about AIDS cases coming from the States. There's express reference to the New England Journal of Medicine editorial from January 1983 and so on. Professor Savage, having attended that meeting on the 24th of January 1983, attends a UKHCDO meeting on the 14th of February 1983. That's a reference centre directors meeting. And again, we've looked at that, but there's an update from Professor Bloom. He referred to the what was going to be later in the year, the Stockholm meeting of the World Federation of Haemophilia. There's reference to reports from the US indicating the incidence of AIDS being higher than at first thought, and concern that the haemophiliac population of the UK who'd received American concentrates might be at risk. And of course, we know from the annual return and everything else we've read from Professor Savage that he was a firm user, even before he switched to heat treatment, of commercial products rather than exclusively NHS products. So he's there at that February meeting. Professor Savage also attended the special meeting that was held of reference centre directors on the 13th of May 1983, and that, you'll recall, sir, was the meeting specifically called, not least in light of recent publicity in the press, radio and TV, to discuss what should be done in relation to AIDS. Again, we've looked at that on a number of occasions, and that's the 13th of May. We can see from a Haemophilia Society document which is at HSOC 002946_024, that this was a meeting of the Haemophilia Society's Executive Committee on the 12th of May, so it's the day before the 13th of May special meeting. And if we turn to the 4th page, under the heading Research Grants, there's a number of applications for research grants. This is a fairly common feature of these meetings at the time. The second one refers to Dr. Savage, St Thomas's, London. This AIDS-related application had been outlined to the Counsel meeting and subsequently referred to the Medical Advisory Panel, while the application sought $8,235 for an MLSO and $3,000 for consumables. It was agreed that, subject to the agreement of groups who will be written to urgently, that a grant of £8,000 be made available to enable the MLSO to be employed as soon as possible and in advance of the next meeting of the Council. So we don't know what that refers to precisely, but it's clear that there has been, prior to this date, an application for a research grant submitted by Professor Savage to the Haemophilia Society, which is an AIDS-related application. We know, too, from documents we've already looked at, that Professor Savage would have been a recipient of that 24th of June 1983 communication from Professor Bloom and Ritzer with the recommendations, such as they were, about the treatment of children and mildly affected patients and a handful of others. We can also see from the documents that Professor Savage then attended the Haemophilia Centre Directors meeting on the 17th of October 1983. And you will recall, sir, that's the meeting at which Dr. Chisholm raised the concern about, should we go back to cryoprecipitate? And that's an idea that's squashed by Professor Bloom, it would seem. We don't know from the record of the meeting whether Professor Savage was one of the directors who was, as it were, in the Dr. Chisholm camp of having ample supplies of cryoprecipitate. But his Archer statement, I referred to a while ago, his written statement suggests he may possibly have been within that camp, because he talks about cryoprecipitate as being both safer and available. But that's a matter of speculation, so that the minutes don't identify which directors were recorded as expressing a similar view to Dr. Chisholm. We know then, if we move forward to December 1984, that Professor Savage attended the meeting at Elstree of Reference Centre Directors. And we will look at that just to see his interventions in the meeting. So if we go to HCDO 0000394_117. We can see here the list of attendees, which include down towards the bottom Dr. Savage. And then, again, so we've looked at this on a number of occasions, but I'll just flag up, therefore, some of Dr. Savage's particular interventions. If we go to bottom of page 4, please. We can see under the heading Factor VIII concentrates, it was agreed that HT, so heat-treated products, should be given to all patients if freely available, to include those found to be antibody positive. In the case of antibody negative patients, it was agreed that from now on treatment must be with HT material. And then we see the observation from Dr. Savage at the top of the next page. This has and would continue to create severe financial problems for treatment centres. It may be that's a general comment rather than one particular to his own circumstances, because our understanding is, given in particular the evidence we've heard from Dr. Winter, that by this time he is treating his patients and has for some months with an early heat-treated product. If we go on to the next page, please, Henry, bottom of the next page, we see that Dr. Savage suggested that a task group be set up to look specifically at the AIDS problem in relation to haemophilia. The chairman agreed that the reference centre directors would consider this. That would appear to be the suggestion which led to the establishment of UKHCDO's AIDS group, which then met for the first time in January of 1985. If we then go on, Henry, to your page 9, Henry, I think. We can see halfway down the page, Dr. Savage raised the problem of treatment for haemophiliacs who had only received NHS product. Until NHS heat-treated material was available, the alternatives were commercial heat-treated or non-heat-treated NHS material. So he's flagging up there a particular dilemma. Options varied as to whether non-heat-treated NHS product would be used. The chairman suggested it be left to individual treatment centres to determine their policy. And then if we go over to the next page, we see the final minuted intervention from Dr. Savage. It's towards the bottom of the page, above the heading handling of HTLV3 positive samples. On the question of finance, Dr. Savage suggested that a case be put to the DHSS for financial support by representatives of the Haemophilia Directors Organisation. Any recommendations for treatment would need to be supported by recommendations for financial support. The chairman advised that the case for more money had already been put to the DHSS. So that's the individual interventions of Professor Savage at that particular meeting. So you'll no doubt draw your own conclusions as to what Professor Savage did know or ought to have known about the developing picture in relation to the risk of HIV and AIDS. We can look at what he said to the Archer inquiry in that respect, perhaps most usefully in his written statement to the Archer inquiry. That's ARCH 0002508_002. And we can see, if we go to page 6, please, Henry. He gives here quite a detailed account, at least of how it was being looked at by UKHCDO and what publications there were. So he says, under the leadership of Dr. Krask, who was in charge initially of the Hepatitis Working Party and subsequently the AIDS Working Party, initially a waiting brief was introduced. Throughout 1981 through to July 1982, AIDS-related disorders were reported exclusively among homosexual men in the US. Then he refers to the MMWR from July 1982. He refers to the November 1982 US Haemophilia Foundation deliberations. He refers to various press reports in early 1983 and to recommendations that were emanating from the states, including the use of cryoprecipitate in all young 4 years or under 4 years old children, newly identified previously treated patients and clinically mild and infrequently treated patients, and recommendations for the expanded use of Ddavp. He refers to recommendations about reassessing surgical procedures and delaying surgical procedures, and then says this, as it were by comparison with the states: no such recommendations were made by the UKHCDO until June 1983, although cryoprecipitate had been in surplus for some years. That would suggest he may have been associating himself with the Dr. Chisholm school of thought about the availability of cryo. And BPL was showing its usual predictably low output of concentrate. US health officials recommended the introduction of surrogate testing in blood donors and exclusion of high-risk groups February 83. That may be a reference to the FDA in March. And then he says this: it was quite clear by late 1982 that there was concern that high-risk donors were infecting the large plasma pools used to fractionate concentrates, and voluntary exclusion of donors was recommended. He refers to various actions by commercial companies, and then says that during 1983 there was a plethora of reports in the literature on haemophilia and various aspects of AIDS and immune suppression. It says this, it's not entirely clear what articles he's referring to. He says he describes the Lancet as confusing the issue considerably, clearly to the benefit of the reactive UK haemophilia treaters, by comparing the apparent favourable AIDS incidence in patients receiving products made from domestic or US imported products with the incidence when product made in 1983 was reportedly given. And then he talks about key reports in May 1983, referring to a Lancet report of a child. Whether he's referring to a later report.
That's the San Francisco baby.
Yes, which was reported rather earlier than May 1983.
It was, I think, picked up in the Lancet later in the year.
Yes. This illustrates, he says, that AIDS is a transmissible agent in the transfused blood that was not another identifiable virus. He refers to a report in Science Journal and so on. If we go further down the page, we see, again, he's then referring to decisions taken in the United States. And he says this at the bottom of the page: at this time, and with increasing reports of AIDS antibody negativity associated with heat-treated product therapy, one can question why such extensive delays were incurring in the UK to license these products and recommend abandonment of untreated sources of factor VIII concentrate. So, although it's not in the sentence isn't entirely clear, it seems to be a criticism of delays in as bringing forward the availability of a heat-treated product. Sort of.
Well, if you go back to the previous page.
He refers to the FDA's licensing in the States.
Yes, and it was the sentence before that led in February in the US to conclude that heat-treated factor VIII from homosexual excluded donors would be available first in March, April 83. And in fact, that may deal with donor selection, who could give plasma. And in fact, the FDA issued full licenses to these heat-treated products in late 83, early 84. So it's saying that in the States, heat-treated product was available in late 83.
And he's drawing, I think it's fair to say, an unfavourable or unflattering comparison between the progress and speed of response in the States and that in the United Kingdom. We then see his criticisms continuing in the following paragraph. If we go to the next page, please, Henry. Where he says, during the years 1983 to 1985, the UK HCDO received little, if any, information concerning haemophilia treatment from the representative Professor Bloom regarding information from other more influential committees, but recommended in December 1984, that's the document we've just looked at, or the minutes we've just looked at, some 14 months after the US recommendations on cryoprecipitate, and 3 months after MACAC declared the overall use of heat-treated products for haemophilia, that heat-treated factor VIII concentrate should be used, with the caveat that NHS untreated product would be the second choice if treated products were unavailable. And then his criticism becomes very clear. This could hardly be termed expedient, and to some extent preserved the political and financial future of BPL. And then he goes on to observe that not until June 1985 that Professor Bloom, on behalf of UK HCDO and the BMJ, recommended the use of heat-treated factor VIII. So one can see there both what he says about the state of knowledge, and there's no suggestion from him that this is anything he personally was unaware of, and then his criticism of a delayed response in the United Kingdom, including on behalf of UK HCDO. So that's the evidence that we have currently in relation to Professor Savage's participation in and knowledge of decision making in relation to HIV. I'll come back to summarise what we have gleaned from the patient evidence on these issues at the end. Professor Savage was obviously still in post during the growing sense of concern about VCJD in the 1990s, and we've detailed in our written note his attendance at a range of UKHCDO meetings which map out how this matter is being considered, the question of VCJD, and what the response should be in terms of the provision of information to patients. There is nothing in particular that suggests that Professor Savage was particularly instrumental in shaping that response. He's a faithful attender at most of the meetings, and the evidence suggests that effectively the standard form notifications to patients in relation to VCJD, which we've seen from other haemophilia centres, were probably the materials used at St Thomas's to notify patients of the position in relation to VCJD. We don't have in the documents, the contemporaneous documents, very much information about how St Thomas's or Professor Savage organised the care and treatment either of those diagnosed with HIV or in the early 1990s, the care and treatment of those diagnosed with hepatitis C. And so your best guide to that is likely to be to go back to the individual witness statements of those who were treated at St Thomas's. The themes that arise from those are the familiar themes that we have seen from evidence relating to the experience of patients in other centres, not being given advice or warnings of risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis, not being given advice or warnings of risks associated with HIV, being tested then for HIV without the patient's knowledge. There are some or various examples of patients describing the way in which news of their HIV diagnosis was conveyed to them. There's a particularly vivid account by one patient of Professor Savage putting his feet on the desk, lighting a cigarette and saying, you're HIV positive, or words to that effect. The same picture emerges, or a similar picture emerges in relation to diagnosis of hepatitis C. Again, there are patient statements which describe patients not being told that they were being tested for hepatitis C. There are statements which are critical of the way in which then the positive diagnosis was communicated. And there are concerns expressed about delays in the communication of that diagnosis. I'm not going to deal with any individual statements by name, not least because many of those are still in the process of being needing to go through the stages of redaction, and in certain cases anonymisation that would be needed before the material could be disclosed. But the picture that we see from St Thomas's is really remarkably similar to the picture that emerges from patients describing their experiences in other centres. There is some evidence in a meeting of the UKHCDO's AIDS group of a recognition by Professor Savage of a need for there to be counselling. There is also some evidence that the centre at St Thomas's employed a psychologist at some stage, but it's unclear from the materials we've seen whether that was a full-time post, whether it was a bespoke post for those with bleeding disorders or those who had been infected. And it's not been possible to to determine at the moment exactly when that psychologist was appointed. It looks as though it might have been the late 1990s or early 2000s, and it's not clear how long that post remained. There are accounts from individuals, some who said that they did receive psychological support and assistance at St Thomas's, and others who describe a very different experience. So I'm going to come to consider Professor Savage's involvement in research. I'm fairly comfortably, I think, going to finish the presentation today, so maybe that's a convenient point at which to take a break now, perhaps for half an hour, and then pick it up at 3:30, and I can complete the presentation there.
Yes, well, let's do that then. 3:30, and we'll conclude. Do you have a rough time so that people know what their plans might be?
No, I would expect we'd be finished by 4:15, so.
So no later than 4:30, probably.